Chadborn. I'm a research fellow at the University of Nottingham and working with Ian Carmody, my colleague who's a medical student. We've been doing a literature review about social prescribing for dementia. So this is supported by the Applied Research Collaboration in East Midlands because I'm a DEMCOM research fellow, if that means anything to anyone. If you know, you know. So just skip quickly on to the background. So I think many of us will be familiar with this term social prescribing, and it's basically a way to get from GP practice into community resources. So this could be really beneficial for people with dementia. For example, for post-diagnosis care, for the living well with dementia, which is a kind of pathway that's implemented across England. And as I say, a practical link to link between primary care, i.e. GP consultations, to community support and resources on a sort of day-to-day basis. So that's the kind of potential. So we sought to explore what the research could tell us about that, but also we were interested in whether the research could tell us whether there are particular issues that need to be considered for people with dementia for social prescribing. For example, memory problems. Could memory problems be an issue for social prescribing? Apathy and mobility are other aspects of dementia that could be difficult for social prescribing. And also whether the presence of a care partner, family member or spouse was also an important element of social prescribing. So just to say a bit more formally about our research questions then, so we're aware of studies of social interventions in communities. There's fairly weak evidence for benefits. But there are many studies, for example, art, creativity, museum interventions, music, etc. We're kind of lucky because there's just been a recent publication of an international consensus study, and this describes what social prescribing is. And this is the other problem, is that many people have different understandings of exactly what social prescribing is. So we use this as the basis of our literature review, and I've given the reference here. But this is a consensus study done on an international basis. So we've got a good idea of what the actual structure of this intervention that we call social prescribing actually is. So our research question, what evidence is there for social prescribing link worker to support people with dementia to care and care partners to activities in the community? What are the evidence gaps, and to synthesize the evidence according to this consensus study description? I'm just going to hand over to Ian now to go through the methods that we used.
Thanks. Hello. So in order for us to assess the literature for social prescribing in dementia, we used a scoping review method, so that meant that we could access broader literature. It meant we could look at peer-reviewed articles, and we could also assess some grey literature as well. We were really keen to keep our search broad, so not only did we look at studies that involved people living with dementia, but we were also looking at those with a mild cognitive impairment. We looked at studies that involved dementia alongside other conditions. One of the main components to our search was that we only included studies that involved a link worker. And that is because having a link worker is fundamental to the definition of social prescribing. It's in the international consensus document. It means that there's a dedicated individual that will bond with the person living with dementia, will adopt a person-centred approach, will be able to access local resources, local knowledge, and then can tailor a specific activity for that individual, and then can support them throughout the process. So having a link worker was absolutely essential for our search. And then finally, we wanted to reflect social prescribing internationally. So in Singapore, for example, instead of link worker, they use the term wellbeing coordinator. So we search for that. In Wales, they use community connector. So we search for that. So hopefully, by keeping all of these terms in, we hopefully didn't miss anything. And then if we just have a look, despite keeping our search really broad, we only ended up with 124 articles. After title and abstract screening, we're down to just 26, which included a grey literature study. We excluded a number of studies because they didn't have a link worker. So, for example, a study by Kamik et al. 21 that explored an arts-based intervention. They demonstrated that there were improvements in terms of well-being, in terms of autonomy, in terms of self-identity, but because there was no link worker, we excluded it. And then after reading the full text, we were down to just 7. So clearly there is a paucity of evidence for social prescribing in dementia. Neil is now going to discuss our 7 included articles, and he's going to talk through some of the evidence gaps that we found in our review as well.
So this gives a summary of the 7 articles that Ian's just mentioned. Am I in the way? And I'll just run through briefly to give you an idea. So the top 3, part of the problem that Ian's just mentioned, that different terminology, these top 3 don't really fit into what we understand as social prescribing. But we felt we had to include them anyway. So partly that's because that they're referring to health services rather than community-based services. So for example, the top one, it was a link worker, but it was more linking into standard health services, and with a particular aim in mind to address stigma. And similarly, the next 2 are about care homes and also outreach. So not quite exactly what we mean, but we felt that they did meet the inclusion criteria. The next 2, the middle 2, McLaughlin and McGowan there, were abstracts only. So again, because we're using a scoping review, we could include these, but we had very limited evidence from those studies. We have tried to follow up some of these, tried to contact the authors for more information. The next one, you might see one of Clarissa's studies, so it's good to include that study. And then the final one, you may have heard of green social prescribing, which has been going on across England, and that's an interim report. So again, we don't have final data from that evaluation. So now I'm just going to run through some of the key themes that have come up. And again, I'm referring to the themes from the consensus study that we mentioned earlier. So the themes are running down the blue column on the left there. And I'll just go through these quickly. So the top one, referral process. A couple of studies have shown that the GP is often the referrer, and that's the kind of standard model that we think about. Sometimes the referral was coming from the memory clinic, so that's great that there's a link there to the memory clinic. Occasionally self-referral, and self-referral is a bit of a funny thing, I think, because are people just suddenly going to refer themselves, just sort of out of the blue? I guess it's often prompted by maybe the GP receptionist, or probably someone else has suggested that they self-refer. Moving on to the function of the link worker, as Ian's mentioned, this was a key aspect of our inclusion criteria. And we've covered a few different types and descriptions there. And that's all about delivering person-centered care, and that clearly came up in a couple of the studies. Finally, the resources that I keep on referring to, there are a variety, for example, Tai Chi, exercise, mindfulness, and other creativity resources. So just to sort of reiterate the key points, I've talked about the self-referral and we've talked about the role of the link worker. I think a key point I'll draw on is the policy. Now, we've seen a lot of policy documents talk about social prescribing. Many of these include dementia and say that, social prescribing is good for dementia. But actually, when you look at the evidence, there's basically an evidence gap. So our review, this scoping method, we've been able to identify that and say there is a gap there. There's evidence of absence, if you see what I mean. What does this mean in practice? Is this occurring in practice or not? And we've talked to social prescribers as well, locally, and we're hearing it's not happening to a great extent. So that indicates there are some challenges for social prescribing in practice, and we can't really give too much evidence about that. So I'll just move on to summarise key points in terms of validity and strengths and weaknesses of the study. As we've talked about, we've only found a few articles, so this is a kind of limitation of the claims that we can make here. We did do a systematic search, so that gives us confidence that we did find all that we could have found, all that is out there, if you like. We've excluded many due to no link worker, and we think that's a critical element of social prescribing. And the strengths are that we use this international consensus document, and the weaknesses are just the limited evidence base, really. So I'm just going to hand over to Ian to finish up with implications.
Thanks. Okay, so clearly there's a paucity of evidence. There's heterogeneity between the studies, so future research is important. We could consider running some trials, so we could take a large group of people living with dementia, we could split them into groups, so we could have one group with no intervention, so a control group, and then the second group we could assign randomly assign a social activity like an arts intervention. And then in the third group, we could give them the full social prescribing service. So a dedicated link worker, someone who has a person-centered approach, will tailor a specific activity for that individual. And then we could look at outcome in terms of are there improvements in well-being, autonomy, self-identity, etc. Of course, there are some limitations with running a trial like that. It's difficult to standardize a service if you're using different link workers, so maybe a realist evaluation might be more appropriate. It would be helpful if we could assess how social prescribing affects different stage dementia. We know that motor deficits are likely to present at some point in the disease course that could obstruct participation. Issues with memory might impair adherence, that could affect attendance. So if we could assess how social prescribing might impact mild stage dementia relative to moderate or severe, that might allow us to steer where social prescribing would fit the best. And then finally, is social prescribing for dementia, is it cost effective? We know that from the National Academy of Social Prescribing 2022 that they demonstrated social prescribing can reduce GP visits and save costs if you look at a number of different conditions. So it'd be helpful if we could do some research for and make it more dementia specific. For example, you might find that crisis intervention is reduced with social prescribing, and obviously that would reduce the pressure on primary care. So, as Neil said, there's a lot of talk about social prescribing for dementia. It's in the international consensus. When you look for the research, there's very, very little. So it's only really by conducting future research that will allow us to successfully tackle the unmet needs of our valued individuals with dementia in the community. Thank you very much. That's the end of our presentation.